The Germans' success in concentrating and using armored forces in a fast-moving offensive in the early stages of World War II astounded military observers. The impacts were remarkable, even for forces that had already experimented with large-scale mechanized warfare. The collapse of Poland in 1939, followed by the defeat of the French army and the British Expeditionary Force in France in 1940, created the notion that massed tank forces were practically invincible when utilized against unprepared defenders. The U.S. Army concluded in 1941 that mobile anti-tank units were required to intercept and defeat German armored spearheads. The War Department introduced a military concept that was unique to the U.S. Army on December 3, 1941, the tank destroyer. The term tank destroyer was expanded to encompass soldiers, equipment, and units alike. Tank destroyer units were planned to be used as full battalions, held in reserve and committed at vital points, rather than as small defensive strongholds. The emphasis was on mobility, and the ability to outmaneuver the attacking armor. In terms of vehicle design, mobile tank destroyers were to be heavily armed, but with speed taking precedence over armor protection. Unlike tanks, mobile tank destroyers were not designed to survive hits from enemy AP rounds, but rather to resist small arms fire. In addition, crews were trained to hide their vehicle from hostile fire. Tank destroyers, like armor and artillery, established their own branch of the Army with the support of Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the Army's Chief of Training and Doctrine. The tank destroyer concept envisioned battalions working as autonomous units, capable of reacting quickly to large enemy tank attacks. When mobile troops were threatened by enemy fire, U.S. tank destroyer doctrine called for them to move fast to a certain position, fire on enemy armor once they were within range, and then retreat immediately and take up another position. The Army did not intend for its own tanks to specialize in protecting against enemy panzers. The new armor branch aimed to replicate the Germans' bold armored attacks. However, the tank destroyer doctrine did not mean that tanks were not supposed to fight other tanks at all, a popularly believed myth. The U.S. War Department Armored Force Field Manual at no point says that U.S. armor was inadequate enough, that dedicated tank destroyers had to be brought in. Speed and mobility were prioritized, with turreted armament capable of destroying enemy armor, and barely enough armor to withstand small arms fire. This was in contrast to the slower Russian and German tank destroyers, which were heavily armed and armored, but lacked turret. Turrets were considered unnecessary luxuries for the defensive anti-tank role. The turrets were part of an American doctrine that envisioned a more active role. The initial tank destroyer units had to make do with hastily constructed vehicles. The M6 was essentially a 37mm anti-tank gun mounted on a 3/4-ton truck. The M3 gun motor carriage, or GMC, was an overloaded M3 half-track, with a French 75mm howitzer mounted on top. Both variants lacked turrets and were lightly armored. The proven M4 Sherman chassis was given a modified 3-inch high-velocity anti-aircraft cannon, and the resulting combination was designated the M10 Wolverine gun motor carriage. The M10's major shortcoming was its lack of armor protection. It had an open top turret, which exposed the crew to shrapnel and small arms fire from above. Its armor was also thinner overall than that of the Sherman, in order to prioritize the vehicle's speed. The M10's hand-cranked turret was so slow that a full turn took 80 seconds. The U.S. Army employed 7 tank destroyer battalions during the Tunisian campaign in 1942-1943. They were, however, invariably broken down to the platoon level to support infantry troops, contrary to Doctrine. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion, at the Battle of El Ghouder, was the only time a tank destroyer battalion was used as an organized force, defending against an attack by the 10th Panzer Division, destroying 30 of its 57 tanks. This engagement was notable for being the only time a battalion fought as an organized independent unit against an armored force in open terrain, as envisioned by the original tank destroyer concept. 24 of the 601's 36 M3 GMC tank destroyers were lost. They also lost 7 M10 tank destroyers from the 899th Tank Destroyer Battalion in the battle. The tank destroyers were not well liked by Allied commanders due to their significant losses. General George Patton declared that the tank destroyers had been unsuccessful. McNair answered by explaining the tank destroyer's role. It was to be a highly mobile force that sought out and occupied favorable positions in order to meet an oncoming enemy attack. The North African campaign resulted in significant revisions to the overall doctrine. The Italian campaign, which began with the landings in Sicily in July 1943, was the second theater of operations for tank destroyer units. While German armor was available in the theater, it was rarely used in large battle formations. As a result, the tank destroyers were tasked with a range of various tasks, the most common of which was providing local artillery support. The last few M3 GMCs in Italy were replaced by the M10. Despite its inability to deal with the frontal arc of Panther and Tiger tanks, the M10 was adequate against most enemy armor faced in Italy, as well as heavier tanks from the flanks. As tank destroyers were pushed into infantry support duties that exposed them to artillery and infantry fire, their crews piled sandbags on top of them to detonate Panzerfaust anti-tank projectiles. Additional machine guns and even armored panels covering the tank destroyers' exposed open tops were among the field improvements. The M18 Hellcat was first deployed in the Italian theater in the summer of 1944, and it was initially not a huge success. Its high speed was only of limited utility in the constricted terrain, thus it was essentially a slightly upgunned M10. In 1944, new Sherman tanks with their own 76mm guns arrived, further blurring the line between tank destroyers and tanks. Sherman tanks were now equally effective at tank hunting. By far, the largest employment of tank destroyer units was in the Northwestern Europe campaign through France, the Low Countries and Germany. They were used from the start of the campaign, with one battalion landing on Utah Beach in a follow-up wave on D-Day. It was in France that the Allies first encountered the German Panther tanks. The superior frontal armor of this tank, as well as the Tiger I, Tiger II, and newer Panzerjägers, made U.S. tanks and tank destroyers less effective. Despite weak armor and a lackluster gun, the M18 Hellcat had the highest kill-loss ratio of any American fielded vehicle in the entire war. Only in August 1944, the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, using the Hellcat exclusively, knocked out 54 Panthers and Tigers, along with many other smaller tanks, while only losing 17 of their own. The presence of the German heavy tanks accelerated the development and production of U.S. armored vehicles armed with 90mm guns, with the M36 tank destroyer being the first to be introduced. Tank destroyers were active throughout the Battle of the Bulge, fighting at close range on broken terrain, much like they had done in Italy, and, despite their flaws, were an important part of the successful defense. The battle also marked the first major engagement of the M36, with its 90mm cannon. The 3 battalions deployed were quite successful. The M36 was being introduced in numbers before the offensive began, and it was crucial throughout the Ardennes offensive. While tank destroyers had demonstrated their versatility and efficiency in combat, particularly in secondary roles, their long-term utility was becoming questionable by 1945 as Army doctrine changed. Their primary mission was to destroy opposing armor, but this was being replaced by tanks, as had happened in many other armies. The 90mm gun on the M36 was also carried by the M26 Pershing tank, which was beginning to reach frontline units by the end of the war. In many cases, tank destroyers were utilized in the same way that tanks were. According to an analysis of ammunition expenditures, tank destroyers in Europe fired approximately 11 rounds of high-explosive ammunition for every round of armor-piercing ammunition, indicating that they were deployed for general support missions, far more frequently than as anti-tank assets. Furthermore, the Army was fast shrinking following the end of the war. The tank destroyer branch cost the equivalent of 3 or 4 complete divisions, a definite luxury for a non-essential service. By the end of the war, the tank design concept had crystallized around the main battle tank, and they provided commanders more tactical flexibility. The 1945 General Board Report resulted in the disbandment of tank destroyer battalions, and the Tank Destroyer Center was closed on November 10, 1945, thereby terminating the force's long-term prospects. The last battalion was deactivated in 1946. While the United States developed a few more specialized anti-tank vehicles, such as the M56 Ontos, Army doctrine would eventually assert that the greatest means of taking out a tank is another tank. If you have enjoyed the video, please subscribe and support the channel for more. Many thanks for watching.